unfortunately. Ability to start.
We're on, we're live, yes, and we're recording as well.
Yeah.
I will call the meeting to order, our October 12th, 2022 HECC meeting, full meeting. Please, Guthrie, would you call the roll?
Yes. Terry Cross,
Here.
Sandy Rowe,
Here.
Natalie Arnott,
Here.
Arnell Fajardo, Greg Hellman. Here. Aislinn Matthias.
Present.
Fernando Rojas Galvan.
Present.
Emily Simnett.
President.
Rukaya Adams. Motutama Sipeli.
President.
Ricardo Lujan Valerio.
Present.
Helen Edwards.
Present.
Richard Devlin. Vanessa Becker.
Thank you. I do have some opening remarks today. Thank you for bearing with us while we got all of our technology in place. Those of you who are joining us via Teams today, we are in HECC's wonderful conference room that has recently had some additional tech equipment for video conferencing installed. So we were experiencing the getting that going. It worked well this morning. So we are on. I have been, I want to just let people know that I've asked Commissioner Rojas Galvan to serve on as HECC's ex officio representative on the Oregon Community College Association Board. Thank you. And that was a seat that was held by Frank Gillard while he was on the, until his commission expired. So, and I think you attended their meeting on Friday. Was that it?
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing that. And Commissioner Simnett has joined the Funding and Achievement Subcommittee, and I want to thank her. And I want to just remind anyone who was interested in serving on that subcommittee to please let us know, and we'll make it happen. We need good minds on our committee. It's a particularly thought-provoking committee, and so if you'd like to think and contribute to good thinking, please join. In addition to our usual reports from Ben and the governor's office and the legislative update and Kyle, we have several consent items to consider today. We will also be considering some rule changes. We will receive testimony from Jess Jasper, president of the Oregon Marshallese Community Association, a little later. We've at least one person signed up for, Cindy Roberts has signed up to give public testimony. And Guthrie, keep us posted if we get any additional people.
Of course.
This evening, our commission members will have a dinner together with the staff. It'll be the first time in 3 years we've really been able to sit down together, and no business is conducted, but we get to know each other. And because we have, I think, more than half of the commission has joined since the pandemic, maybe even 2/3. It's really important for us to get to know each other as fellow commission members, and I have a few introductory things planned for the time we have together this evening. I want to acknowledge OPB's article on the 40-40-20 goals and thank Ben for sending it to us. It was timely leading up to our discussion tomorrow on our goals and on our strategies. I think it also serves as a primer for new commissioners. Also want to thank OPB for their coverage of the Oregon Tribal Student Grants. That was a really great article and helped us get the word out. Tomorrow we will spend some time taking stock of our strategic plan and where we've come from, how we're doing, perhaps consider if we need to make any mid-course corrections. This is early in discussion. But as we begin our meeting, and I want to share some thoughts about my experience in having joined the commission now almost 7 years ago. When I joined, it was a pretty steep learning curve. Particularly the jargon and the acronyms are a little bit difficult to get squared away with how you're thinking about things. And I appreciate that we attempt to make sure that we're not talking in speak. So I encourage everyone to at least once in a conversation spell out the acronym if we're engaged in a conversation. I joined the commission was just a few years old, and I have watched as the commission became more focused in its strategies and its goals. I watched staff turn our discussions and ideas into actionable documents and to give form to our high-level conversations, which I really appreciate. And for those of you who weren't part of that, I want to point out that the agenda, you'll see it organized around particular areas. And the idea was to use our strategic plan, the areas of our strategic plan, as the buckets that we look at on our agenda. So there's, you'll see on this agenda, reporting. I think of that strategic area as informing the public dialogue about higher education, using our opportunities to listen to people, to look at data, so that we can shape a policy level conversation through that reporting process. So we rely on our thought partners in this area and our own capacity for leadership, using that reporting function to influence and guide statewide policy. We have a bully pulpit, so to speak. Well, we don't have authority to do a lot of things. We can sure talk about them and inform the public dialogue. Another of the strategic areas is funding. So we're really focused on ensuring higher education is funded strategically to reflect the values and goals established by the commission over time. Striving really to accomplish our goals for the entire state while balancing the interests of all of the stakeholders in the system, and always leaning that advocacy towards student affordability, access, completion, and equity. So we're really trying to shape public policy by the role that we have in funding higher education, or our portion of that. Another of the strategic areas is we refer to as pathways. And I think of that as working to make higher education, making the system student ready, rather than students having to be college ready. We also want the system to be student ready, decreasing barriers to completion, getting young people from the K-12 into higher education, doing our best to ensure that every credit students take count, making sure that every certificate and degree is of value and leads to meaningful work, and finally that employers have a skilled workforce. That's a big package. And the last one is outreach, and I was going to call on him to kind of summarize that outreach strategy.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Krause, and I'll be brief. I appreciate that you're highlighting the fact that much of our agenda is organized around those 4 areas. We did that starting years ago to try to, at the request of the commission, to try to really focus our agenda on the areas of activity that are of highest strategic importance to the commission. Area 4, expanding opportunity through outreach, is probably the least developed of the commission's kind of 4 major strategic action areas. It speaks to our role, or the commission's hope, that it would have a major role in connecting Oregonians, young and old, with post-secondary opportunity through direct outreach. Some of that is in the service of our financial aid programs, connecting them with grants that or scholarships that we administer. Some of it may be about providing direct service to students or potential students through better advising, mentorship, other forms of support. We do some of this today through programs like Aspire that we administer. We also administer funds that the legislature appropriates, much of which gets passed to partner organizations like the Oregon Trio Association. We heard from their executive director at this morning's F&A meeting, like Avid, like College Possible. We make grants to those organizations to connect Oregonians with post-secondary education and training. But in spite of some effort by the commission in past legislative sessions to increase our role in this realm, it remains a relatively, I would say, underdeveloped area of action for the commission.
Thank you. Well, as I've learned about higher education from the point of view of a commissioner, I have grown more and more committed to holding ourselves to and our stakeholders to a high standard, and to supporting every partner in the system to do the best job that they can do to serve Oregon and the students of Oregon. That means we lift everyone up. We try to advocate for the best that our state legislature can provide and that we can provide as policymakers. In that spirit, I believe that the most important job we have as commissioners is to cultivate a united voice for advocacy for the goals that we and our stakeholders hold in common. And this means, I think, that we courageously and transparently hash out our differences when we have them, that we hear one another, that we strive to hold each other up, and always remember the values and principles that serve us in creating that united strength to advance higher education in Oregon. So these are my thoughts leading into our conversation of how have we done, where are we at now, any mid-course corrections along the way. And with that, I'm just really looking forward to our best thinking over the next couple of days. And so the first item of business is we have minutes to approve from our last meeting.
Yes. Shall I send them on the screen or in a paper copy?
We don't have.
They should be included in the meeting materials. 1.3.
Oh, yes, we got them.
Do we want to table them until tomorrow morning?
They're in the packet.
Okay.
Guthrie, 1.2.
Do you want a motion or do you want to
I'll take a motion if
move for approval of the August minutes?
I have a second. And moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Abstentions. Motion carries. Thank you. So I'm going to turn this over to Ben.
Thank you, Chair Cross, and it's great to have a majority of the commissioners here in person and several joining remotely. Commissioner Arnott and Edwards, you'll be happy or not to know that you're on very large screens. The commission gets a good view of you. It's almost as if you're at the table, and Commissioner Sapelli or Lujan Valerio or others who are joining remotely, please do also feel free to join by a video if and when you're able. It feels like, again, like a bit of a milestone post-pandemic that we're able to have a 2-day meeting together. We started the tradition of 2-day meetings, annual 2-day meetings with an evening and sometimes a tour together, typically not actually in the Salem area, very early in the commission, and then that went on hold, and now we're kind of getting back to having these times to commute while we work on post-secondary education and policy. I have a number of remarks, and I think though, what I will do and make a habit of doing is starting to provide written materials to complement my oral executive director's report, because as I worked with staff over the last couple of days to identify some of the key updates, I realized there's a whole bunch of things to tell you about that are happening at the HECC, and some of that I think I can do in writing. So I'm gonna skip over portions of the activity that's been occurring at this agency on your behalf for the last couple of months, even though some really important and exciting work going on, and present some of that to you in writing. But I will touch on a few highlights. Before I do, I will note for the record that within your packets under this item is the typical report on our progress against our current budget, our current biennial 21-23 budget. So if you have questions about those figures, which are accounted for through the month of August, please let me and our operations director, Tom Reel, or our budget team can follow up about any of the information that's supplied in that item. This is an interesting period for the commission and the agency. It's a bit of an interim. We've completed our budget recommendation that you adopted and that we submitted at the end of August. We are waiting on an election that will determine the new governor for the state of Oregon. And of course, the legislative session will begin formally in February and in earnest, formally in January and then in earnest in February. And in the meantime, from a policy standpoint and strategic standpoint, I think a little bit of a holding pattern. There's our upcoming meetings in November and December will be quite full with end-of-year reporting that the commission is responsible for, and you will be reviewing and asked to approve or make modifications and approve a number of end-of-year reports that we are responsible for. We will also, at our November and December meetings, likely hear reports from the community college and university presidents on their about to be completed study of the future of Oregon higher education that the consulting firm NCHEMS is in the process of finishing up. That has a lot of implications, I think, for our work going forward. You will also likely hear from the Secretary of State Audits Division on their audit of the HECC and its work with community colleges. So those are a couple of kind of teasers for some of the items that will be on your November and December agendas. Looking back over the last 2 months since we held our last regular meeting in August, I want to note the Aspire Fall Conferences that OSAC, our Office of Student Access and Completion, held in September at Eastern Oregon University and Western Oregon University for the large community of Aspire volunteer mentors that we train and support and gather in these annual convenings. Those are important events and that are connected to the outreach mission of the HECC. And then I want to flag that later this month, we will host our Adult Basic Skills Conference, an annual event. It used to be known as the GED Conference. It still focuses heavily on GED and supports for GED learners, but more broadly, the adult basic education programs in Oregon. And Commissioner Rojas Galva will be one of the keynote speakers at that conference this October 24th and 25th in Salem. So we're looking forward to that. A few program notes. Several of you are familiar with the work that we have launched in partnership with ODE and with math faculty and math departments around the state, as well as high schools, to develop and support the creation of new and better math instructional pathways for learners. And this is I think ultimately has some policy implications for our colleges and universities, as well as for the HECC. We were just accepted to join 19 other states as part of an initiative led by the Charles Dana Center at the University of Texas, Austin, in collaboration with a whole bunch of national organizations that are helping fund and support this work around the country. We will, through that process, which is a multi-year project, get support in implementing modern math courses and content, helping creating leadership infrastructure to provide ongoing professional learning for modern math courses, developing and refining advising practices, and helping change or leverage math policies that affect math pathways. So again, it's a big partnership effort. We have a staff role in that. We're working with the Oregon Community College Association, as I mentioned, math faculty, both at the high school and post-secondary level from around the state. But really exciting. And I would say, if you look at, from an academic standpoint, where the barriers are that our students get sort of hung up on that stop them from completion, math is at the top of that list by far. There are a lot of other barriers, as you know, but academically that has been the greatest. And some of that is about related to the kinds of pathways and kinds of pathways that we have today and the ways that those need to be updated and reformed. I think I told you in August, I announced to you in August that we had hired our Future Ready Oregon director, Jennifer Purcell, who's here to my left, who led the initiative, the creation of the initiative for the governor. And then after it was funded by the legislature and we became responsible for implementing a big chunk of it, we were fortunate enough to convince Jennifer to come to the HECC and lead that work for us. It's well underway. We've gotten a lot of money out the door already in support of the Prosperity 10,000 portion of that, in support of the career pathways funding for our colleges, community colleges, credit for prior learning programs that are funded or activities that are funded under the bill, as well as the initial round of funding for workforce readiness grants that we're in the final stages of reviewing now, and with close to $10 million going out the door soon in support of those applications. So just a tremendous amount of work ramping up that program, and we're on schedule with that, and that's really, really exciting. It is the beginning of financial aid season. So October 1st is annually the date at which we open the FAFSA and the ORSA for next fall, next school year's applicants. We are supporting that, as we routinely do, through OSAC, but this year with the aid of a new website. So one of the HECC's sort of nested sites is OregonStudentAid.gov. This is kind of the homepage for Oregon students seeking financial aid, seeking the Oregon Promise or Oregon Opportunity Grant or other scholarships or grants that we administer. We've now upgraded that site to be mobile friendly. There's also the application itself for Oregon Promise and our programs that require an application is also mobile friendly. So we're pleased with the updates and the launch there, and have seen a high level of interest in our programs. Just in a couple of days, I think several hundred students have already submitted their Oregon Promise applications for next fall. So we are kind of tracking that in real time, and really pleased with the traffic that site and that application is receiving. We're continuing to take Oregon Tribal Student Grant applications for this year. So, when that program was funded by the legislature, we launched it. We put a sort of target deadline for students. I think it was August. We weren't sure whether the funding the legislature had provided would be sufficient to fund every eligible student. We are now confident. Students can continue to apply. We have not run out of funding. So tribal students, if you qualify or think you might qualify, please be in touch, submit the application. We're continuing to accept those. I think I'll just mention a couple of other kind of policy-oriented items and then conclude. I think Kyle in his legislative report will likely touch on the work that we're continuing to do with the legislative task force on underrepresented student success in higher education. We made presentations to the legislature during its interim days a few weeks ago on related to the Oregon Department of Education report on the college-ready diploma and changed diploma standards. I expect in November we'll get a fuller brief on that from ODE. And we also share with the legislature some of our expectations and finding related to student loan forgiveness and the recent Biden administration announcement of that. Just on that topic, it's not sort of directly within our wheelhouse, but we are supporting students or others who are interested in better understanding how that works with by connecting them to the new student loan ombudsman that the state of Oregon established in the Department of Consumer and Business Services. So we have an emerging partnership with this new student loan ombudsman in a separate agency who will be helping direct folks to if they're interested in pursuing loan forgiveness and have questions about that. The state of Michigan yesterday, Governor Whitmer signed into law a bill that doubles their state commitment to financial aid, massively expands direct state investment in affordability over multiple years of ramping up. I think eventually it'll be about, for that state, about $500 million of new investment annually. So another state that's taking a big leap forward in terms of student financial aid, and I hope creates additional energy, additional envy maybe for Oregon policymakers as they look around the country and think about what we're doing and what we like to be doing and should be doing for students. And hopefully they'll look at our proposal for that investment for Oregon. Finally, I think I'll just mention, I sent an email to commissioners just a couple of hours ago. We had a great discussion this morning at the subcommittee about the community college funding formula, and wanted to recognize our great staff, and in particular, Jim Pinkard, whose paper titled Higher Education Funding Review Process Best Practices was published last month in a higher education policy journal. So, you're being advised by a genuine, bona fide, published expert on higher education funding review processes, and we're excited about that. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll conclude my report. We've got a great agenda over the next couple of days. I will note, I learned this morning, as this relates to the agenda, that Rob Anderson, who's the president of the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, and planned to be with us tonight for dinner and tomorrow to present on SHEO and its support for organizations like ours, and his thoughts on higher education, state higher education across the country. Unfortunately, he is sick and not able to make the trip from DC, and will postpone his presentation to another meeting. So that's my report.
Thank you. And do you want to say anything about the SHEO, given that you chair the organization now?
Yeah, so I was elected in July to chair the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association for this academic year, essentially October 1 through September 30th. So I am the new chair of the State Higher Ed Executives Officers Association. I joined that group when I became an HECC executive director in 2013, and I thought, what in the world am I doing here? Because they all seemed like they all knew everything about higher ed, and I knew nothing. And but I enjoyed getting to know my new colleagues from around the country, and lo and behold, almost 9 years later, I'm one of the senior SHEOs in the country, at least in terms of duration in a SHEO position. That organization, which is, it's like many professional organization, it has annual kinds of conferences. It provides other supports to folks in my role, as well as the staffs of these organizations. It does it exceptionally well. They have a fairly robust staff. They had a couple out yesterday visiting with our team to learn more about the HECC and find out better how they could support us. They produce a number of reports that we make heavy use on to understand policy trends at the state level from around the country. They advocate for states in DC, so they are one of our, and I would say our primary voice in Washington on higher education issues, and in particular how they affect the states and the state policymaking role. They host an annual policy conferences that many of our staff have attended over the years. So an annual meeting for the folks in my role, the executive role, and then an annual policy conference, which with a similar agenda, a lot of great speakers and a lot of great sharing of information and ideas about higher education policy and how states can move forward on a common agenda of attainment and success for the residents. Final thing I'll say about CHEO, because it's just been such a pleasure to kind of work with it over the years. And what I hoped you would get from Rob's presentation, and I expect you will when we meet again, as unique as we are, because every state is different in terms of how it governs higher education and to some extent the types of issues that they're working on, we share a whole lot. When you go from Oregon, the higher education agency in Oregon, to the higher education agency in Missouri or West Virginia or Connecticut or Florida, it turns out their issues, their challenges, their goals, their dynamics, and you sort of squint a little and they're not very different, right? Whether that's a very conservative state, a very liberal state, a state with a lot of centralized authority, or a state with a lot of with highly decentralized. The issue set is, the dynamics are very familiar. And so it's been, I think, a real source of support and camaraderie for me and for other members of our team who have been in partnership with our colleagues around the country on these issues. And I hope that the board, the commission, will also, through some level of CHEO engagement this year, get that sense that your board is not unique either, right? There are boards like yours and commissions like yours in most of the other states, and they are wrestling with many of the same kinds of issues and dynamics.
Thank you, Ben. I just want to give my appreciation, and I think the appreciation of the entire commission, to have an executive director who is in this position of leadership with this highly important organization. So thank you for your leadership. And sometimes leaders locally suffer when they put energy into energy at a national level. And I want you to know that we're fully behind you and support you, and are proud to have Oregon play that role of leadership through your representation. So, thank you. So the next item on our agenda is the governor's office report. Is Sifrain there? Sifrain, welcome. I'll turn it over to you for the governor's report.
All right. Well, good afternoon, Chair Cross and members of the commission. I'm Efren Zamudio, and I have the pleasure of serving as Governor Brown's Senior Education Policy Advisor. It's great to be with you today. For my governor's office report, I want to cover a few topics. First, I want to thank each member of the commission for your work developing the Higher Education Coordinating Commission's recommended budget. That's a mouthful. I also want to thank HECC staff for their work on the Racial Justice Council community engagement process, a months-long process to incorporate the voices of community in our budget and policy making, work that has impacted the budget you have proposed, along with a racial equity impact statement. Governor Brown sees this as a critical piece of our work to make Oregon a more just and equitable place for all, and we hope the next administration will continue this too. As you know, this budget season is a little different. Governor Brown will not be developing a governor's recommended budget this year. That responsibility rests in the new governor's hands, whoever she may be come November. The incoming governor and their transition team will develop their governor's recommended budget for the legislature to consider by next February. I share that with you because now more than ever, your leadership is critical to keep the work of the HECC moving forward. While there is uncertainty with the transition of government, a changing legislature, and an uncertain budget outlook, there are also opportunities. Opportunities to demonstrate the need and for incoming leaders to learn about the great work and programs at the HECC. One of those programs is the Oregon Tribal Student Grant. I just want to share how excited Governor Brown is to see enrolled tribal members across the state seizing the opportunity this grant provides so they can advance their education. During the Pendleton Roundup, the governor rode alongside a student who shared with her just how much the Tribal Student Grant meant to them and their impacts on the future. And recently, at the Government to Government Tribal Summit, everybody was talking about the difference the Tribal Student Grant is making. Thank you all for your leadership on this. We need to make sure this program is made permanent and has adequate funding next legislative session. Governor Brown is committed to doing all we can through the transition to ensure this continues, and I hope you all join in the effort. And lastly, as Governor Brown finishes her term, one of the things she is focused on is the work of the Semiconductor Task Force and working with a coalition of leaders on a package for next legislative session. It's my understanding that you all will hear a presentation on these recommendations tomorrow, and I know you will join Governor Brown in recognizing the importance of a cross-sector approach continue to make Oregon a place this industry can thrive. Thank you all for allowing me to speak to you today, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Evan. Any questions? Well, hearing none, I thank you for coming and for all of the work. This is it's great to hear from the governor's office at our meetings, and particularly the work on the tribal grant. We're really pleased to hear about the governor's experience as she goes out. So, thank you. So next item on our agenda is public testimony, and we have Cindy.
I think we'll start with Jess Gasper.
I'm sorry. The invited testimony, Jess Jasper, President of Oregon Marshallese Community Association. Jess?
Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me? That's good. My name is Jess Gasper. I'm the President and Executive Director for Oregon Marshallese Community. I am honored to be here with you guys. I want to thank everyone here at HECC for allowing me to speak about, our people. Well, I'm from, like I said, I represent Oregon Marshallese Community Association. We're a nonprofit that was established in 2019, registered public charity and a community advocacy organizations for the citizens of the Marshallese Marshall Islands, and their descendants residing here in Oregon. Our primary mission is to maintain the culture and traditions, and also improve the quality of life, and that in terms of education, health, and social welfare. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is a sovereign nation in the Pacific Ocean. The Marshall Islands is a sprawling chain of coral atolls between Hawaii and the Philippines. A little bit of history about the Marshall Islands. From 1946 to 1958, it served as the Pacific Proving Grounds for the United States. So it's kind of like where they tested their nuclear arsenal to show the world how powerful this country is. So the nuclear testing began in 1946 on Bikini Atoll, and after residents were evacuated. And over the years, 67 nuclear weapon tests were conducted in the Marshall Islands. The U.S. government relocated entire populations and exposed others to cancer and disease-causing radiation. Bikini Atoll, where my grandfather is from, was the site of the U.S.'s largest 15 megaton hydrogen bomb, known as Castle Bravo, and it was detonated in 1954. The blast was 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped in Japan in World War II. And my family, our residents of Bikini Atoll, were forcefully relocated in 1946 and shipped off to several different other locations. But due to unstable food and water sources, a lot of them had to leave the islands. Eniwetok Atoll is one of the other islands that was tested on. A hydrogen bomb named Mike, codename Mike, was tested on Eniwetok Atoll. And Runa Dome, which is located on Eniwetok Atoll, also known as the Tomb, is a thick dome of concrete at sea level encapsulating all the radioactive waste. And with the rise of climate change and the fact that the dome has been leaking radioactive materials into the Pacific Ocean is a huge concern for Marshallese and scientists across the world. And I know a lot of you guys are wondering, why I'm talking about, nuclear and the history of the Marshallese. Well, a lot of these folks have moved away from the Marshall Islands. 1/3 of the population has left the Marshall Island to the U.S. Because of, the history aspect of this, and in a special relationship between the U.S. and the Marshall Island, an agreement called Compact of Free Association. This agreement allows Marshallese to live and work and move freely between the two countries without a normal visa requirement. So currently around 30 to 40,000 Marshallese reside here in the US, and many of them come to flee from the effects of climate change while also seeking better opportunities, work, healthcare, and especially education. And the effects of nuclear testing has polluted our water, our food sources, changed our way of life, and health effects has had a tremendous impact on the Marshallese. And when the Marshallese, or when a Marshallese family moves here to the US, they expect this Hollywood lifestyle, like they see in the movies. When they arrive, they're faced with, many different challenges, like language barrier, a lack of certified translators in hospitals, schools, and in courts, insufficient income, reliance on easily exploited or low income work, a difference in way of life, cultural misunderstanding from the receiving community, and racism, overtly racist treatment by service providers and even the public. And in terms of education goes, imagine if you were a young child moving into a new country, going to a new school, and you face these issues, language barrier, racism, cultural differences. Going to school becomes really, really hard. You really never feel welcome. You don't feel heard or understood. And when you do speak up, you feel like you're a burden to the school or to the teacher or to the other students around you. So you end up skipping school. It's better to get in trouble so that you don't have to go to school because you don't feel welcome. Here in Oregon, the NHPI has the highest dropout rate here in the state. So these are the issues that we see and that we're asking and that we're listening to our community members. And this is what they're telling us. Our kids don't feel welcome. And in terms of higher education, this is all about higher education. In our Marshallese community, higher education isn't a priority. Higher education is a privilege, for the wealthy, for the kids who have parents who are in positions of power. As soon as a child reaches working age, 18 or graduates high school, their parents encourage them to get a job. Students feel obligated to help out their parents because they've seen the way that they've been struggling, as they migrated here. Students don't get the support that they need to pursue a higher education. And because there is no support for higher education, students aren't able to navigate ways of getting a scholarship, loans, or grants. When a school or counselor tries to communicate with the parents, due to the language barriers, they aren't engaged. And it's easier for the student just to get a job. I think there was a testimony, Alyssa gave a testimony. She said, between me and my parents, we do have a language barrier, and I am the first generation college student. So I was filling out the FAFSA information by myself. And you see this all across, the Marshallese community where the kids are taking that initiative, to fill out these FAFSAs by themselves, or if they feel burdened by their parents, you're old enough to get a job, they feel like they need to get a job first to help out their parents, before they pursue their own aspirations. But here at OMCA, we focus on, outreach when we're out there and speaking with the community. We focus on the 3 C's, right? We focus on culture, communication, and career. Culture, knowing that the parent has full influence on these kids' lives, knowing that you need to first engage with their parents, knowing that you need to engage in language that they understand. You need to communicate with them and provide, resources, the materials that they can actually hold and understand. And then talk about career paths that our community colleges can provide. We have a really good relationship with Semiconductor Community College where we're able to talk about career paths, with these parents. And our hope at OMCA is to partner with, more local public schools and colleges to help overcome some of these aspects or obstacles that our students face. Having a familiar face in schools, having Marshallese navigators that can actually reach out to parents and speak our language, and to, understand, what they're going through, and have more grants and scholarships geared toward Marshallese students, more in-language information that we can share with families and opportunities that allow the students to work and maybe go to school at the same time so that they can kind of lessen that burden, and even like financial assistance for the home. These are the things that we would, love to see higher education commission, really focus on. Not just, I believe these are the same needs as the other communities of color. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you guys for, taking the time to listen to me and listen to our story a little bit. And then I'm here if you guys have any questions.
Thank you for being here today. Any questions for Jess? Just in preparation for the meeting, I had a chance to look at your website. You want to tell people how to find you? There's some really interesting things about the cultural outreach, cultural support programs you have.
Absolutely. Our website is www.oregonmarshallese.org. It also has links to our social media. Currently, we're helping families help them enroll in social services like food stamps, help them with financial assistance. We are also helping parents enroll their kids in FAFSA. So those are the things that we're working on currently, and we're also focused on COVID-19 work with the state of Oregon.
Thank you so much. The next item on our agenda is our public testimony. Cindy Roberts, I just saw you pop in.
Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chair Cross, Vice Chair Rowe, Commissioners, Executive Director Cannon, and Mr. Stafford. I'm Cindy Robert, and I represent the Oregon Alliance of Independent Colleges and Universities, Oregon's 12 nonprofit higher education institutions. You will recall that at your last meeting, both myself and Grant Matthews of Lane Community College spoke to you about the college's statement of need to offer a Bachelor of Applied Science in Business. The Alliance was concerned that the proposal on the moniker business makes this degree outside the applied science and technical fields focus of Senate Bill 3 and dilutes the structural differences of the LCC proposed degree and those traditionally offered at four-year institutions. We stated that those distinctions should be both clear in the title and also be fully described to both a student and an employer. We offered some alternative names that we believe better reflected the curriculum described and the applied skills focused legislature intended. After your meeting, the Alliance continued to converse with Mr. Matthews, and we most recently learned from him that they were considering changing the degree title to Applied Business Management. We immediately responded in writing that while the addition of applied in the title is good if it is actually used, the term business management still confuses the audience, whether a student or an employer. While the title is in fact the outward facing concern, the basis of what we want the moniker, why we want the moniker to change is deeper and something that I think you would all agree with. Applied degrees are different than those that are considered traditional, but generally that is only truly recognized by the academic community and not as much by the general public. Hence, our drive to help LCC provide as much accuracy as possible in the title. An applied degree at its core focuses on providing a student coursework and learning that is applied to skills and disciplines used in the regular world, whereas a traditional business management, business administration degree will include theory in the classroom and have required applied and practical experience requirements. When looking at a large discipline like business, if you simply use the label business, you're making any distinctions to the student employers harder, and adding management, a word traditional programs placed in titles, does not help in the attempt at clarity we know we all want. So thank you for hearing our ongoing concerns on this issue.
Thank you, Steve. Other thoughts or comments on?
Mr. Chair, I'll just note that you will be receiving from Donna Llewellyn later this afternoon sort of an update on the process that the commission engages in to review and consider applied baccalaureate proposals for new applied baccalaureate degrees. So will be an additional opportunity to sort of get your head around this complicated and relatively new for the commission issue.
I believe we heard before, this is a 3-stage process. And we are, with this particular one, we are still at the early stage of the process.
Yes, you have not been presented with a request for final consideration and approval. And Don will walk through, because we're also making some changes to that, or proposing some changes to that process.
Okay. Well, thank you, Cindy, for coming back and continuing to raise the concern.
Yeah, I'll keep you updated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Guthrie, anyone else signed up online since we began?
Not so far.
Oh, okay, well, I think we are we're ready to move on to our consent calendar. Looking at Commissioner Devlin, I want to make sure that,
Yeah,
I thought you had a question earlier.
I did have, I just want to put a couple of things on the record. Normally, when you have a consent calendar in front of the body, you actually have somebody from the body reviewing it and recommendation that it's going to be on the consent. And obviously, we can take something off the consent if we choose to, but I'm not asking for that. But sometimes it would be good to be able to ask more questions about some of these in advance. And I'll just give a couple of examples. In the case here for Treasure Valley Community College, which is going to an applied associates in nursing, and they're also going away from the curriculum from the Consortium of Nursing Educators in Oregon. And that's a program that makes it possible for community college students to get their first 2 years at community college and then go on to get a bachelor's in nursing if they choose to. They're OHSU, they're probably not connected to these, but they probably would have more prospect to go on to some of the private institutions that offer a bachelor's degree. I don't know if this change will affect the ability of those students to go on and get a bachelor's degree. Maybe it doesn't, maybe it does, but I don't really have any ability in this process to really ask that question. Then another one, I got more than two, but I'm just going to give two. Western Oregon is trying to approach a new program, completely new, that is obviously probably very needed. If anybody has been in need of occupational physical therapy, they know that there's an extreme shortage in the state. But in this particular case, which I think is particularly well thought out, it's completely new. There are no faculty, there are no facilities. They're indicating that they're going to have to hire the faculty, they're going to have to meet all these requirements. Western doesn't have a facility for this program. They'll either have to build a new facility or they'll have to take some existing facility and change and renovate it for this purpose. And they're planning on having a group of students in academic year 24. It's not as long now as it sounds. I mean, it's extremely ambitious, and sometimes it would be good to hear directly from the party how they're going to approach this to be able to get this up and running in such a short period of time. And then the third thing I'd like to put on the record again is we get all these and they go through this process and it doesn't seem that any are ever denied. But also, we don't have a ability to go back and look at all these projections and to see if people have actually achieved everything they plan to achieve. And I think it would be good if we could change the process so we could go back and look at actually all of these that we've approved, how they have actually played out in the actual real world, and also to be able to ask some of these questions directly as an application comes in. I'm concerned both from the standpoint of the institution, but particularly from the standpoint of a student. Are they getting a credential that will have some value to them in the future? We obviously know that there are many people out there in the non-public world that are pushing various programs that may have very little actual value in the real world. And I don't want us to be getting into that simply because people want to create more programs. So I think a little bit more oversight would be better, at least a retrospective oversight of looking at the programs that we've approved. They've actually come to fruition.
Thank you. And my understanding of the process is these are fully vetted by the staff. I certainly hear your concern that there may be issues that we need to hear about, from a policy level. So I appreciate, so you're not asking for us to pull any of these?
Not as a whole. Probably what I'm asking specifically is that some future meeting we could have a more broad discussion,
About,
even to be notified a few months in advance. These are coming forward. So if we wanted to have input to the question staff of the parties that are proposing these, so we can get those questions answered.
Mr. Chair, yeah, I think that's a very appropriate request. And so we will schedule at either the November or December meeting a sort of orientation to how we currently manage program approval process, which does involve a lot of staff work with the institution, with the proposing institution, and ultimately a staff recommendation to the commission of whether this should go on your agenda with a recommendation to approve. And we at that time would be happy to work with the commission and take feedback from the commission on, or a decision on how to modify that process, potentially to allow for some additional commission time to review. I will note one of the dilemmas, we don't have to get into it, but one of the dilemmas that we face is timing, because by the time these reach a commission agenda, having been through multiple layers of typically faculty approval, institutional board approval, sometimes accreditor or licensing board weigh-in or approval, by the time they get to us, they've often been years in the making, and the college or university is asking us to move very quickly because we're the final stage, and they are concerned typically about additional delay. That being said, this commission has the ultimate authority to approve or not, and the policy questions that you've raised are really important ones, and I'd like to be able to address those and discuss those in a future agenda. The other thing to your comment about looking retroactively, that's been a discussion the commission has had over the years, and we have pointed out that while that is probably possible and can certainly see value in it, the commission has, under current law, no authority. So it's not as if, even if we were to review a program and determine that it had failed to meet the kinds of outcomes that it had told us that it would meet, or that had been developed in the way, even if it had failed to develop in the way they had told us they would develop at the point they asked for our approval, under current law, the commission's authority is only to approve or deny the creation of a program. And we have no ongoing responsibility to review and potentially revoke program authority. So,
Mr. Chairman, I understand that, but at least we have the knowledge of those that we approved, whether or not they achieved their goals or not.
yeah, that makes sense. My sense is, even if we have a refresher or a primer on what the steps and stages are, or what the criteria what criteria are met for it, for items like this to get on our consent calendar, that would be of great help to knowing what the vetting process has been. And I think we had this discussion about 4 or 5 years ago, but just before most of the members of this, of the currently serving commissioners. So thank you. I think this is an important discussion. One item that I had over the years, I've asked, how come we always get new things, and there's never an agenda item on things that might be retired from the curriculum, and it's we don't have authority in that area either. So with that, I will entertain a motion to approve the consent items on the community college program approval. It's been moved. Is there a second on the motion? Second. It's moved and seconded. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Any abstentions? Motion carries. Also need a motion on the approval of the University College program approvals. Do I hear a motion for approval? I moved by Commissioner Rowe, and do I have a second?
Second.
Commissioner Simnett seconds, and any discussion on the motion? No discussion on the motion. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you. And next item on our agenda, we are speeding right along and catching up on time. Is Kyle with us in person?
He'll be
Online?
online.
Oh, there he is. Hello, Kyle.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair Cross and members of the Commission. Kyle Thomas, Director of Legislative and Policy Affairs for the HECC. I think my report will be briefer than usual this time around. I'll talk mostly about the activities of the Joint Task Force on Student Success for Underrepresented Students in Higher Education. So after a very busy calendar year filled with committee investigative hearings and site visits around the state, the task force is in the final phase of their work intended to lead to recommendations, I think centered mostly on affordability, student support and wraparound services, and culture and accountability. To work through these proposals and craft recommendations, the task force has formed 3 work groups mirroring these issue areas. And as we've been from the start, we're both active participants in the formal meetings of the work groups, as well as behind the scenes participants working to help guide some of the work of the task force. Despite all of the work of the task force and our direct and consistent involvement and communication, it's not yet clear what will be contained in the final report and recommendations coming out over the next couple of months. It does appear that the issue that most members agree on at this point is the need to support affordability through increased investment in the Oregon Opportunity Grant. It's also clear that legislators appreciate the early successes of the Benefits Navigator system they established and funded in 2021, and may look for opportunities to improve and expand upon Navigator-like services for students. But it's really not yet clear how the task force members will undertake the careful work of winnowing down the myriad other proposals into a final report and final legislative package. Any task force recommendations are likely to be constrained by available resources, as it's very unlikely that any additional revenue will be available in 2023 to support task force proposals. It's also simply too soon to understand how the legislature may respond to the task force report and how any resulting legislation would be shepherded through the legislative process. With competitive House and Senate races, a new governor, and the legislative retirement of the current chair of the task force, other members will have to step up and take on the burden of promoting any legislation and navigating the legislative process. As soon as the task force report and recommendations are available, we'll provide a presentation to the Commission, and there might be an opportunity for the Commission to endorse the report in whole or in part, or provide guidance to the incoming governor regarding the recommendations that are contained in the report. I don't plan to go over our legislative concepts today in any great detail, which continue to be summarized in your docket because I provided information on all of them in the past, except I will confirm something that I did say in the last meeting, and that is we have in fact added an additional legislative concept. Legislative concept number 472 provides HECC with immunity from civil liability for any actions that we take regulating entities that provide training in psilocybin therapy. Today, HECC is the only state entity with any official responsibilities in the psilocybin space without this immunity, because our role as a regulator of private career schools was not considered by the ballot measure that established the legality of psilocybin therapy. While we don't believe there are any real significant risks to HECC that it would not prevail in any suit targeting issues around the practice of psilocybin therapy, more the responsibility of the Oregon Health Authority, or issues targeting manufacture and distribution of the drug, more the responsibility of the Department of Agriculture or the Oregon Liquor Control Commission. The fact that these entities are immune from liability and HECC is not does increase the risk that HECC would receive and need to defend such a suit. And this LC is intended to put HECC on parity with those other agencies that I have named. And lastly, I don't usually do this, but I'll relay a legislative rumor that I've heard, which is we are hearing at this point that the House of Representatives may revisit the idea of having a higher education specific committee in 2023 or for the duration of the 2023-2025 biennium, but the structure, of course, is unclear and will remain unclear until well after the elections in November. That's all I have today, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions for Kyle? We're a quiet bunch today. Well, Helen, you look like you have a question. Am I reading that right?
Well, no, it's just a dumb question because it's like I don't actually understand what all of that meant.
That's okay.
I was just sort of sitting here just a little bit confused. So anyway, I'm sure I can figure it out.
Your look was quizzical, not questioning.
Yeah, but I know I was kind of lost in the details, but I just sort of I was just confused. So anyway, I can catch up with you later on it.
We'll also say that that schedule of legislative concepts didn't make it into the compiled materials packet, but it is now published on the website for 8.0.
Thank you. I'm on the website and I'm looking at it.
Okay, I was going through my data and it's not.
All right, that's why I was. Let's see. All right, no, if there's no questions for Kyle, thank you, Kyle. We appreciate your report as usual. We are scheduled in our agenda for a break at this point. Let me ask Amy if we come back in 15 minutes, will you be ready with and then take?
Yes, we will.
Okay, let's take our 15-minute break now. We'll come back at 20 minutes to 3.
We in recess?
We're in recess.
Okay. I am going to mute
Next item on our agenda is the under strategic action, activity 1, reporting Oregon Longitudinal Data Collaborative, past and present. I'm going to call on Amy Cox to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Chair Cross. For the record, my name is Amy Cox, and I'm the Director of the Office of Research and Data. And many of you are used to hearing me report about post-secondary data and research related to the work of the Commission. But there's actually an additional part of my office, and that is part of the office that works on not only post-secondary, but also K-12 and employment data. And so I'm here really only for introductory purposes to introduce to you Ben Tate, who is next to me and the director of that program. When that program came into the HECC 3 years ago, we were excited and a little cautious. We knew the program had been under development for several years. And with the sunsetting of the Chief Education Office, needed a new home, and it came into the HECC. And as I said, we were both excited and cautious, and both were warranted, I will say. And since that time, really, Ben Tate, that's who you're talking to, the other Ben. Ben Tate has steered that program through some turbulent waters into some pretty exciting space today. So I'm happy to introduce to you Ben Tate, and I'm going to step aside because this is really this show.
Thank you, Amy. Chair Cross, Vice Chair Rowe, members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to come and give you an update on the Oregon Longitudinal Data Collaborative. For the record, my name is Ben Tate, and I am its director. So as Amy mentioned, we've had quite a journey over the last three plus years. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of recap of the journey, but I really want to spend the majority of the time talking about where we are today and where we're headed tomorrow. Got 3 minutes slowed. Perfect. So I thought I would start just with who are we? So the Oregon Longitudinal Data Collaborative is an interagency shared service between the Department of Education, Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and the Employment Department. The goal of the program, we manage what we call the statewide longitudinal data system. Love big long terms and acronyms to express things. And that system is used to bring the individual data collected by those agencies in, we match it, and then use that integrated data to study for different analysis and research studies. So I always like opening with this slide to talk about the difference. Over the course of the history of this project, both terms have been used to describe us, OLDC and SLDS. Both are accurate, but we often talk about OLDC as the program, SLDS as the system. So sometimes it's helpful to think about OLDC as the home of the SLDS. That's why I like to link the acronyms. Next slide, please. Amy mentioned a little bit of the history. There's a lot on this slide, but I want to draw your attention to really 2020 and where our journey really picks up. I'm happy to answer questions if folks have on the earlier history, but 2020 is really where we started to move. When we came into the HECC in 2019, we were transitioning from project to program, and in that time we surfaced a couple of issues. This is what Amy was referencing with the caution being warranted. And really there were 3 major buckets for these issues. One was that the governance structure that had been set up for the project really was insufficient for running the program. Second, the data sources that we had, while correctly connected within the system, were too narrow. And so we had a very, very narrow view of Oregon students' experiences. And thirdly, the data presentation side of the system was inflexible and also narrow in its design. And so this limited our ability to meet initial agency needs. So really in 2020, moving forward to where we are today, you'll see the progression as we started to resolve those issues, and we really moved into an operational space. And I'll touch on a couple of those things as we progress. The other thing I'll highlight here is the team. We noted the team's been on a bit of a journey too. starting with kind of a broader team. We lost folks to retirement and other positions at the unfortunate time of right in the middle of the pandemic. And because of the budget concerns, we could not rehire for a while. And so we had a space there with a very small team. We are fully staffed today. You can go to the next slide. So the first thing I mentioned, the data sources. This is what we had in 2019. So we had data from the Department of Ed on K-12 students, from HECC on public post-secondary, and then matched to employment. But we were only able to match initially if you had checked both of those boxes. So if you were a student that went to an Oregon K-12 and went to an Oregon public post-secondary, we had a chance of getting your wage record. If you didn't check those boxes, we couldn't see you. And so that really limited us in the initial design. Guthrie, if you can go to the next one. This shows you where we are today. So we have filled out, we have GED and the National Student Clearinghouse to really broaden our picture, both of K-12 outcomes and post-secondary outcomes. We worked with several state agencies to broaden our ability to match to wages, and I'm happy to say that we hit 70 to 75% match, and that's if you had a job at any point in the system. So I always want to caution that that isn't like full-time employee, that's you showed up in the system. And so we're able to successfully at least say that we were able to match you when you were in the system. Next slide. We'll go to, this is our next step. So this is planning for the future. We really want to broaden out what we see as post-secondary outcomes. And for us, that means working with the Bureau of Labor and Industries to get data on apprenticeship programs. And then within HECC, getting data on the private career schools, which we don't currently have in the system. So we'll be able to talk about apprenticeships and those non-degree credentials that those paths offer to students. Next slide. This is our governance structure. So one of the other issues that I mentioned was that the project governance was insufficient. This is what we built to replace that. So all of the agencies that provide us data are invited to be part of this structure. We have our executive committee, which Director Cannon is on, along with his counterparts at Education and Employment, as well as the state's chief data officer. And then we have our subcommittees that focus on research, which Amy is on, data and privacy. And not only do we run all of the projects we work on and their priorities through these committees, it also is what approves what data we use, how we use it, and how we secure it. So pretty much every aspect of the operations of the program run through the governance structure. Slide. So I wanted to focus now on where we are today, and then starting with what we provide. So we talk about our program really focusing on 3 products. One is raw matched data. So oftentimes the agencies have a need for this for their own reporting needs, federal or state. And so we have a lot of what we focused on originally was in this bucket, was providing that data to the agencies. Secondly, we also talk about what we call a derived data report. This is often a 1 to 2 page infographic, usually providing high-level overviews of a topic, and then the in-depth research studies. Slide. How do we decide what we work on? So I mentioned it running through the committees. This is what we call a research agenda. We start that conversation with the research directors, identifying what the key projects are for the given year. We do this in the summer. So our research year is September to August, kind of mirroring the traditional school year. We do this in the summer and then focus on getting that approval in the fall and then moving forward. So we just are in the final stages of approving the research agenda for the coming year. We then take that agenda and analyze it to ensure that we have the data in the system that we need to complete the projects. And the opposite is also true. If there was data that we had from a previous year that we no longer need, then we'll remove it from the system until we need it again. And the technical setup we have with the agencies allows us to do that fairly easily. Next slide, please. So this is what we did last year. And I mentioned before that it was a real focus on the raw data files. That was in part a function of us exercising the system kind of a small step at a time, and also a little bit of function of the team size. we were down, I didn't have a research component until the start of this year because we had vacant positions that we hadn't been able to fill. And so we focused initially on what my technical staff could do, and that was the raw data files. Once the research folks were on, we started to shift into data reports and research study, which you see kind of at the bottom there. I'll highlight two, but I believe I'm going to come back at a future meeting to really dive in. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through here because this is really intended to just be the program overview, and we'll dive into the specific ones when I return. Slide. This is our first, an example of one of our initial data reports, which we've been calling Education Pathway. So we take a group of students, in this case, students who enrolled in high school in the 2006-2007 school year, and chart where we see them today. And so it's a backwards look. We chart seeing what ODE saw as their exit, and then what we see from looking from our vantage point as enrollment and attainment in post-secondary, involvement in workforce, and median wages. This is the cover sheet of what will be our first research study, which we're calling the Healthcare Education Shortage Study. I was listening earlier, someone mentioned the nursing programs, and that is an area of interest for us as well. So the premise of the study is that nursing is one of the highest demand jobs in Oregon, and yet the supply being generated by Oregon post-secondary programs is very low. So we explored some of the causes for that and recommend some potential actions. And this will be the kind of my last slide. This is what is currently proposed for the 22-23 research agenda. I mentioned we're still kind of finalizing this. There were some questions that we're running down before we call this final, but the focus here really are on studies that inform agency efforts on poverty, job training and placement, and equity. So that finishes the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Great.
Thank you. Ross, your data is at student or individual level?
Correct. Yes.
Variable at that level?
Yes.
How do you protect identity?
Great question. So at the moment, the only people that have direct access to that are members of my team. When we provide the agencies the data that they've requested, we only provide it with their ID number. So we use our own ID in order to be able to match it across. But when we provide it back, they only get their own ID, and it doesn't have name, date of birth, or any other identifiable information on it. At the moment, we have chosen not to engage with or accept external research proposals, in part because we're still getting used to the system and because the team is still relatively small. But the same approach is what we would use for that too, where we would restrict it to IDs and not anything that was personally identifiable.
You generate a unique ID that's unique to this system, correct? So you're not able to connect or interface with other data systems.
We do, so the ID we match, we have what we call our agency crosswalk. So it links our ID to agency ID. So I could tell you that, student ID 123 for ODE is student ID 456 in community college. But yeah, in terms of meeting to the outside world, it's going to be a meaningless number.
I got a quick. Aside from adding new data sets, the two that you suggested that are sort of institutionally coming in, what are the new data sets what are other data strategy approaches can you take to get more temporal richness in the data, or what are you thinking about on those fronts?
I want to make sure I'm understanding the question. You're asking about other data sources, or are you talking about data just like the design of the system?
Other data sources.
Other data sources. So we've had, what I talked about was what's coming up in the next year. We are having ongoing conversations with the Emerging Early Learning Agency. I actually just met with them today. So that's kind of on the horizon, knowing that that's really a key one for us. we really want to focus on education and workforce connections. So we've talked about, do we connect to juvenile justice? Do we connect to health and human services? And there may be a need for those. Both of those arenas are really big and a little daunting at the moment. So it's something that I want to think about, and we would probably need to talk about resources to do. So that's why our focus in this next year is expanding post-secondary, and then the year after that, hopefully we'll start digging into early learning.
I've missed something you said, but I'm wondering how you determine the research agenda for the coming year. Is there a group process? Is there a process for the commission to weigh in on what we might think about as being important to study?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you. At the moment, the process is a conversation with the research directors of the agencies, and then a conversation with the executive committee of the agencies. We have talked about, as we really get our legs under us and moving, having more conversations with the different groups that those agencies represent. But at the moment, we haven't nailed down a plan for what we would do.
It seems like the more robust the system gets, the more priority you'll have to set for the potential list of things to study. And so perhaps there could be a process where we help you vet that in terms of policy priorities. I'd be glad to be part of that conversation.
If I may, this program, and Amy introduced it well, is somewhat unique insofar as it exists within the HECC agency. And his staff are employees of the HECC and have offices in this building. We provide fiscal and IT and HR and other support. And it is governed in this interagency way, right? And so I think that actually creates some interesting opportunities. And as the program has finally gotten to the point where it's launching some interesting new research and coming up with new finding, it's starting to beg the question of our relationship to this program. I think, and again, we're sort of just starting to explore this with a little more detail. I think that this program will operate with a fair amount of independence from the commission, and that is probably, I think, could be a very good thing, that it is driven by this interagency executive committee and set of research directors, but will be at a little bit of arm's length from the HECC specifically or any of the other agencies specifically, and can operate with a certain amount of independence. And I mention that because you may, I mean, we'll get the healthcare report or the nursing report that I mentioned, and others as time passes. There may be times where you think, well, gosh, that would have been really nice to have at a different point in the cycle in order to better sync up with the HECC's work, and just understand that this is an interagency program and project that is a little bit of its own creature, right? And that can have will create some challenges potentially, but I think also can create some real advantages for us and our ability to learn from these folks who are going to look at problems in maybe a slightly even different way than we might, or certainly with different data than we typically have.
Yes.
I note that Commissioner Sapelli has a hand up.
Great. Commissioner Sapelli, and then Simnett and Heyman.
Hi, everyone. I just had a quick question. So out of curiosity, what makes this new, like, I know you mentioned that you're doing like a new healthcare research about nursing shortage, but I've read so many studies that have been done both in Oregon and nationwide. So how does this study differ from any other study that's been done?
Great question. So I can give you just a sneak peek of what we'll dive into. So the uniqueness, so some of what we'll start with will be similar to what you've heard before, because we start with a national look. You know, what does the IPEDS data say? What does National Bureau of Labor Statistics say? But really where we then leverage the ability of the system is talking about how does that impact the Oregon students? So what do we see the pathways of students that graduate from an Oregon high school and attend a community college for one of these nursing programs? And how, with the question really being, how often do they stay in the region? So how many of the kids that graduate from the local K-12 program go to local community college and then get a job in the local area? And I think that would really inform our conversation at that regional level, instead of talking about it at a statewide level, which, you know, just using the national data would have left us at. So I don't want to spoil it too much, but that's the question. That's really the area where we wanted to leverage the SLDS and look into that.
Commissioner Smith.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this overview of our work in these reports, and the research agenda sound really promising and interesting. And maybe my question is related to who sets the research agenda. I'm just curious about who, and maybe this is a really basic question, but who is the primary audience for these reports, and how are they intended to be used?
That is a great question, and something as Director Cannon mentioned, that, you know, we've been talking about it in concept, and now that we have products, it's becoming real, and we're having to kind of talk that through. So I'll condition it to say this is my answer today, knowing that we're still going through the conversation a little bit, which is that I view our direct customers as the agencies that provide us data, because they're asking us to use that data to answer specific questions or inform their conversations in specific areas. Now, there's a lot of secondary audiences. The legislature is a big one, advocacy groups, even community groups. We're dealing with data that touches a lot of lives, so a lot of people are going to be interested in this. And so at the moment, our focus really is on the agencies. And part of that is a function of I have a 5-person team, and so, you know, we've talked about engaging in a wider audience, and it's been a little hard for us to envision how we can do that successfully. So that's a long way of saying I think the answer will be different as we continue to mature, but today that's where we're at.
And could I just add to that, and to Chair Cross's question also, since you both addressed the research agenda, you know, I think that, you know, your answer, which I totally agree with, you know, this sort of staged audience is related really to this governance structure and the planning process. And I say that meaning we, the agencies, I'm representing the HECC in this sort of triumvirate, it's actually more now, but of agencies, of primary data partners. We wanted a structure and a set of processes that would outlast the individuals in them. Because the data that we're entrusted with are not only federally protected, but as Ben noted, people's real lives, right? We wanted to set up a process where more than an IT system that linked data, we had a plan in place to create an agenda, a research agenda, products, and pair with the underlying data that would reflect the needs of those agencies that contribute, right? So, you know, for example, you know, ODE, the Department of Education, who works with K-12 children data, you know, we look to ODE to describe the primary needs for a research agenda that they would have, and the primary needs for data that they would have, so that that can get folded into the process in a way that, you know, when any one individual leaves their positions, that's still maintained and secured, if you will. Secured both from an IT data security perspective and secured from an ethical perspective.
Thank you, Chair Cross. And I just remember back when we were talking about doing this, and I was on the Quality Education Commission at the time, you know, and sort of looking through the tunnel from the other direction, you know, and I think we always had this question of how do we know how well a student does after they leave us. And, you know, this is an attempt to answer some of that question. So maybe this is sort of something that both excites me and scares me. I want to know a little bit about the robustness of the data that we have on the individual in each one of those stages. And can we learn something about specific pathways that appear to be more successful for students than other pathways? And what do we do with that?
Yeah. So, and I would love to hear Amy's thoughts on this too. One of the conversations we've had in the research subcommittee is what is success? And at the moment, the only data point we have is wages. So I can define it that way, but with that caveat of success means different things to different people. And so it is a limited view. Yes, the answer to your question is if I define success by annual wage, then we can have a really robust conversation about the different pathways that students take and what those wage outcomes are. One of the interesting limiting factors for us is the length of time that we have. So ODE really says that their robust data collection started in 2009-10. HECC has a longer stretch of reliable data. Their systems have been in place for a while. But that means if I start with that graduating class, if you took a full set of academic, you haven't been in the workforce that long. And one of the things that I'll note when I talk to you again about the education pathway, that median wage comparison, we put on there years in the workforce because it's not an even comparison. You got a doctorate degree, you've been in the workforce 2 to 4 years. Somebody that got an associate's degree has been there 8 to 10. So those wage outcomes are not apples to apples comparison. So there is some limitation that we have at the moment in being able to talk about it from that standpoint. But as we continue to get more years of data, that will even out. And as we add more paths, we'll be able to have I'm excited about what we'll be able to do in a year when we have Foley and private career schools in and can talk about those paths that students take and what those outcomes look like.
To respond to your question, Commissioner Heyman, and thank you for it. I don't think I could agree more with your desire to see the different outcomes that students take, the outcomes of different paths that students take. And I think it's a primary question, probably not the only question that the system could answer, but a primary question that the program could answer, and one that really drove by this initial, you saw the slide sort of infographic, really addresses that from the most basic of perspectives. All students for one cohort for as many years as we can track them. But it begs the next question, okay, well, what about for these students? Well, what about for these students? What about for these students? What about the ones who took CTE in high school? What about the ones who took accelerated learning in high school? What about the ones in this part of the state? So that is another way of saying that I think part of what excites and scares me at this point in the program's development is the sure knowledge I have that the need for it will outpace the staff. So, I mean, the good news is there's a lot of work that we can harvest out of it, and a lot of good answers to good important questions. Like a lot of, dare I say this, things in research and data at the state, it takes longer than we wish.
I guess the other thing that frightens me is it takes longer to accumulate data, requires time. You don't really know anything about. You've got the data on the kindergarten kid. We're going to have to wait 15 years to know anything about that. And my concern is we'll try to draw conclusions too quickly.
And I would add that longitudinal data are really just like a really pull the camera back kind of perspective, are one of the holy grails for researchers. So for those listening who aren't working in the field of research or policy that's relying on research, longitudinal data are really one of the best answers to policy questions, because we're not assuming outcomes, we're watching outcomes, right? We're not thinking that, oh, this is probably what's happening. And if you think about it, a miniature version of that is the graduation rate at a post-secondary, right? So how many freshmen at the universities earn a bachelor's degree? That's like a mini longitudinal study. We don't try and express graduation rates in any other way. We take that cohort of freshmen and we watch them for 4 to 6 years. And this is that sort of in a bigger scale.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I have a couple of questions. This is so promising, and my sense is that the more robust that the system gets, the more both opportunity, but then also requirement to regulate how the data is accessed. So one of the opportunities, I think, is collaboration with universities and students who want to do projects that could draw on this data, and which then I didn't hear that you're considering that your data set as requiring at this point the review of an institutional review board, or my sense is that the more nitty gritty the data becomes. I mean, I remember doing the site visit at North Lake County High School, and there were 10 graduates. So if you're studying that school, you're going to be studying 10 people. So it is. I just want to raise that as a future concern. I have seen in some federal programs longitudinal studies around children's mental health where the data set almost had a lifespan of its own, and it managed to spin off its own bureaucratic process of gatekeeping. So I'd encourage you to have some policies around that sooner than later, in maximizing the use or the value of the data. It can be at the same time protecting it for its long-term viability. I don't have an answer to that, but just a cautionary tale of one data system that I happened to try to get data out of years ago and couldn't study, the native kids. There's very little, just background, there's very little published research on longitudinal information about native children's mental health or child welfare experiences or anything else. When in fact, a number of different data sets have 1 to a few hundred native children in that data set. And if you could compile it across several different systems, you could get, well, it's almost impossible to do that. So, so there are some, I think, real considerations for equity and the notion of who can use data for their own community's well-being. So that's a consideration.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to respond very quickly, we do have an initial data request policy in place, which part of that addresses the IRB component. So I mentioned that at the moment, we're not really entertaining external requests outside of state government. But we wanted to put that in place to start to lay that foundation. And so while we don't function as an IRB in the same way as it does at the university level, the research subcommittee, part of the request that we talked through, part of that process is to examine the ethical implications of any proposed study, to ask the requester to talk about how they've thought about it, what sorts of protections are they putting in place for the use of the data or the results. Because we want to make sure that these things are not weaponized against their communities, right, that they're collecting this from.
Well, you violated my own rule about jargon and acronyms. An IRB is an institutional review board that oversees the data ethics or the research ethics. I interrupted.
Yeah, no problem. I was just gonna kind of wrap up with the comments you made around, you know, at the end, talking, you know, blanking on the specific phrasing you used, but there's more to this. This is really a foundational process, and we know that as the use of the system, as it continues to expand, that we'll need to continue to revisit that to ensure that we are allowing the right folks to access the data to, you know, for the right reasons.
Yeah, just a very quick question. I can't remember hearing if you said, when you said that you have income data for a very large percentage of your, do you have occupational data?
Unfortunately, what the employment department currently collects is they call it the NAICS code, so it's the field. So I can say you're in healthcare, but I can't tell if you're a doctor, a nurse, or a janitor. So we don't have occupation data. All I can get you is in the range of.
You could actually, depending on how much data you have over a period of time. I've seen plenty of studies that say that people that want to be teachers, a very large percentage that get the teaching credentials with the profession after about 5 years, 5 or 6 years. And we're hearing a lot of anecdotal evidence right now that a lot of people in nursing are very active for a short period. Now, we wouldn't be able to tell if they were a nurse. We could at least tell that they were still in healthcare, correct? Or we could still tell that someone was still in teaching, probably.
Yeah, so for the nurses, we could definitely say, here are the people that got a nursing credential that worked in healthcare and then left at a certain time. I think you're right, we can't definitively say they were nurses, but you can draw the inference a little bit. Teachers are actually a different scenario for us because the Department of Ed actually collects detailed teacher data for those that are working in the public school system. So for that group, we actually do have the ability to have a little bit more of a detailed conversation because ODE collects that.
The government could go back longer than people that are no longer with us.
Correct. Yeah.
Commissioner Devlin, I think you will enjoy the upcoming year's reports potentially, but I will say no more. But Chair Cross, I did want to add to what Ben said, and just to the effect that I've been in conversation with the state's chief data officer, Catherine Helms, about her interest in general planning, I should say. I don't want to put her on the spot when she's not here to defend herself, but general planning to establish a state IRB, and have lent my enthusiasm to that.
Any other questions? Oh, Commissioner Simmons.
Thank you. Just as just a quick question, well, a question of curiosity. You said that if wages is the data point of success, then you can begin to draw some conclusions. What other data points of success are you able to look at, or do you hope to look at in the future?
Great question. And this is something that we've brainstormed a little bit with the research directors. You know, again, I feel like both my answers to you are conditioned. So this is my answer today. Knowing that this is an area I want to continue to explore more. This is a quick divergence, but there are systems like this in every state, and there's a community of those systems and the people that work in them. And so it's a question that I really want to bounce off of those programs in other states and how they do it. We've talked about, does home ownership, is that a potential measure of success? Civic engagement, is that a measure of success? Those are areas where we potentially could gather data, and I say potentially because I have no idea what data is collected by the state agencies or our ability to connect to it. But those are areas that we've kind of tossed out as potential ones for us to explore, and it's definitely an area that as we continue to develop, I want to explore more and have more conversations with folks in my programs across other states.
This is something that we consider on our post-secondary side of my office a lot as well, and really across the agency. we use education really as a proxy for, as my now retired counterpart at the Department of Education used to call the happiness index. This idea that we have this, this belief, and there is research, national research that shows that education is a driver of many positive outcomes. We can easily measure money in our society, but it is also, at least in a national sense, a driver of health outcomes, and as Ben mentioned, civic engagement, and marital and family stability. And these are things that we, as a state, do not necessarily have data on, but these are some of the questions that we wrestle with. How could we measure these things?
Commissioner Edwards?
Just a question on technical constraints and technical infrastructure. What are the issues around that and level of investment that's going in at the technical level?
Constraints. So our system is housed at the state data center, and it's designed in a way that, from a storage standpoint, we can scale pretty easily. From a processing standpoint, we can scale pretty easily. I think honestly the biggest constraint is resources, and at the data center we are one of many, so oftentimes it's a prioritization conversation. We've been working with them to shift. Go to the technical details, but shift the technology base a little bit, and it's been a long process because we have to wrestle in their queue with every other state agency that's one of their customers. So I guess my off-the-cuff answer would be both the capacity of my team and the priority of the state data center and the state's IT infrastructure. But from a technical standpoint, not worried today about the constraints of the system, the data that we have in the system, the way it's built. We haven't observed yet any sort of issues as we continue to expand and add data to it.
Thank you. Any other questions and comments? Great information. Thank you so much for coming and sharing this with us. We look forward to more data, more research, and more reports coming our way. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, as we're transitioning and before Ben leaves the room, if I could just take a moment, as you heard, we inherited this system semi-willingly. Thanks, legislature, back in 2019 when the chief education officer was sunsetting, or whatever, 3 to 5 years ago. And the decision was made to house it at the HECC, and I had a lot of concern and some reservation about that, but we took it on. It was a system that had been plagued by both technical issues and other kinds of challenges. Ben's leadership of this program and of this system in kind of the latter days of under the kind of old governance, and then into where you see today, and when he can answer this question, Commissioner Edwards' question about technically it's on solid footing, represents an enormous feat of leadership and energy and integrity on the part of Ben, and I just am extraordinarily grateful. We are really lucky. Anybody else, I kid you not, anybody else trying to do this over the last 4 years, 5 years, would not have succeeded. So thanks, Ben. We're really, really lucky.
Well, it found a good home under the leadership of Amy, I think, as well.
Absolutely.
We all know how much the thought process that we hear, and I'm always bragging about the staff at the HECC wherever I go, but they just the quality of information that we get from all of you and from your team around particularly our strategic role in informing the public dialogue. This has got to be some of the best information available to any commission in the state. I have a friend who serves on another commission who's envious of us. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And I'll echo Ben's congratulations. Thanks. The next item is our strategic activity to the funding, and call on Commissioner Rowe and Jim Hinford to report on our FMA subcommittee.
This morning.
This morning.
Quick. I'll give it a start, and then Jim can come and provide some specifics. We had a very good meeting this morning. We had only 2 update items on our docket. The first was the Community College Support Fund formula review process, and the second was capital improvement and renewal. On the Community College Support Fund, those of you who were on the commission will remember back in the last winter and spring, we had some difficult initial conversations, and I think we had concern from what we were hearing, sort of when it was going to launch, how it was going to launch, if we were all on the same page on the need for the review and the outcomes, when we could expect outcomes. And a lot of that was around timing. So I'm happy to report to you that after today's meeting, I was very encouraged, and other commissioners expressed the same. Jim had set it up so that we heard from one of the presidents from the President's Council of Community Colleges, someone, a representative from Student Affairs, a representative from financial officers, and then a student-centered group. And all of these people are part of the larger commission that's doing this work. We have different perspectives there. But there were some key things that we heard primarily, well, from all of them really. One was that they really have done a good and honest review of the formula as it is now. And at least the people who were speaking to us and representing their colleagues acknowledged the flaws, talked about the need for a new system, and that the community college, the world of the community colleges is changing so dramatically and so quickly. For instance, there are many more people coming in, and some of them who don't want the 2-year certificate, who need this specific job training, which is the programs we're approving. So they're coming for different reasons, yet we have measured success, and the funding has been given primarily for students in their seats. So it's a more complex look. So they talked about that. They talked about that they have already looked at, especially our neighbors in Washington and California, and already have some good things to copy, potentially to put in our set of rules, recommendations from them. One of them, for instance, I can't remember what it was, I think it was Washington, not California, that does a 3-year review of the formula. So there were different things like that, some smaller, some large, that they were considering. Also recognizing when I was talking about the changing reasons people are going to community colleges, talking about the diversity of students in sort of every way, demographically certainly, but again, in their needs from community colleges. And the group, maybe the most important thing that I wasn't sure 6 months ago we would get is they really are, they're so appreciative of the staff and the work that Jim and others are doing, and they are deeply committed to consensus. So that was really good news. And we have conveyed to them that we are completely open and welcoming if there are dissenting reports or different groups that feel like their concerns weren't addressed. So Jim also gave us the timeline for that, which will be, we expect and hope to get their recommendations at our February meeting. And then staff will go about the work of making that into the rules or the formula, keeping us involved, or at least informed about that. And of course, even with the implementation, even once we adopt it, which is tentatively scheduled for June, the implementation, there are all kinds of complicated questions on if the formula changes much, sort of how much can an institution lose, how far of the timeline we do that. And I'll maybe left out the most important thing is it's easier for them to say they will have consensus now because they know we are behind them on getting a larger base funding for community colleges. So if we are not able to achieve that, then all the nice things I said would go away. But anyway, we're all on the same page, and that's it was a bit of a rocky start, and I was just very pleased and to have the caliber of people we have working on it. Jim, on that one, do you?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Rowe. I just, for the record, Jim Pinger, Post-Secretary of Finance and Capital, was a great conversation. I'll just briefly add to that. This wonderful recap. This morning's conversation was fantastic. And all of the commissioners are invited to the F&A subcommittee. So we'll try to give a heads up to when the most intriguing conversations may occur, but sometimes they are unstructured and unplanned. But I will say, though, that to Commissioner Rowe's point, our next substantive touch point for the commission will be February 2023. But I do want to set the expectation that you should also expect in December some sort of progress report on this topic as well. So November's F&A meeting, we have a couple of other topics, but December, I think we can deliver a progress report, which will then send up for February and then go from there.
And this is very difficult work, but I'm talking about we expect their recommendations in February. We had some clear examples this morning of why it will be difficult to do and how the exceptions sometimes can torpedo a rule. So thank you, Jim, for your leadership on this.
Thank you.
Okay, the second thing that on our agenda was the capital improvement and renewal funding update. And that also was interesting. Jim reported to us that the formula, and it's in the materials. I encourage you to look at it for distributing 110 million that's been authorized. That's mostly on the capital improvement and what's the word I'm looking for? The deferred. Thank you. Deferred maintenance. I believe I could forget that for a minute. And it was a very interesting and instructive conversation. It turns out that I think there are two main things, and anyone who is in the meeting and asks the questions, please help me make sure. But there were two things I came away with. One is concern, but no answer, to the fact that on deferred maintenance, each university is defining that themselves. And I mean, we can assume professional standards, of course, but as Jim pointed out to us, the large universities have many more resources and more ability and experience in doing this. But it is self-reported. And Jim also told us the difficulty of, we asked about, well, can it be uniform or can the state do it? And he had been in discussions with DAS about doing it. And there's a huge price tag of well over $1 million in doing that. So the whole question of, okay, how do we, when we have a pot of money, and this represents the 110 million, represents a 50% increase from what was approved in previous biennia, then how are we sure that we're allocating it to the right things, even with a formula that takes in square footage and the history of the buildings and of the campuses? The other question that then helped us raise in honor of our former colleague, Duncan Wise, who raised this a lot in wonderfully passionate ways, is how do you figure out what's the state's responsibility, what buildings are the state's responsibility to upkeep in terms of deferred maintenance, and what is the responsibility of the institution? And then Commissioner Devlin raised the question of, well, and gosh, what about when you get 100 million for a brand new shiny building that's your own doing, then what happens when that building either has serious deferred maintenance, if it ever does, although I hope those are in the initial grants, or needs to be replaced? Sort of, so whose commitment is it? So we, in other words, we ran into quite a bit of, and then Jim educated us about the history of this, which goes pretty far back on not having clarity around those questions. We had a robust discussion, and we have asked Jim, there is a group that deals with this, and we've asked him to go back and to see what staff can do, the oversight group, universities, and what we can do or should do in the future to get better clarity into this. Because we're allocating serious money, and we think we're doing it, we know we're doing it fairly, we think we're doing it properly, but we're not positive. Jim, or any of the commissioners who are in, can you stated that as clearly as I intended?
I think the other side of this is, regardless of what formula we come up with, I mean, this was pretty well thought out. There still is the question about institutions making their own determination about deferred maintenance, but any formula is going to have some issues. I mean,
Yeah.
One that we didn't even talk about is if you start looking at institutions that haven't maintained their buildings, giving them more resources, are you rewarding the fact that they haven't maintained the buildings?
Exactly. Jim, anything else to add to that?
No, I think that pretty well covers it. And we will then focus in the future on bringing back, capital issues to the F&A, so we can have continued conversations around that. But that's, I think, a great recap of kind of the moral hazards and some of the other challenges when we have, state resources that we want to prioritize, because the need, of course, far outstrips the supply. So.
Chair Cross, did you have anything to add?
I just would add one thing. I had a good learning moment in our meeting, and I expressed my dilemma over the years of thinking about this issue of who's responsible for what, and whether the institution or the state is responsible for this long-term cost. And I very much appreciate Commissioner Devlin's counsel, and that at the end of the day, it is a responsibility for the entire state. That we wouldn't question that if it was a public school, and so that gave me food for thought. So thank you for that. And I think it helps resolve that this is a partnership, not a vying for it to be one way or another, but all such relationships are negotiated. So that's the formula process, I think. So that helped me put the thinking about the formula process in perspective of that shared responsibility. Anything else?
Okay.
Great job.
Thank you, Commissioners who attended the meeting. I appreciate your help.
And finally, our strategic activity 3 pathways. See.
Thank you, Chair Cross and members of the commission. For the record, my name is Donna Llewellyn. I'm the director of the Office of Community Colleges and Workforce Development. And much like Amy, I'm just here for a quick introduction for this docket item. I'd like to introduce a new yet likely familiar face to many of you, Shawlee Hodson, who has recently joined our office as a policy advisor for our team with a specific focus on credit for prior learning. And today she's actually here to talk to you about our agency legislative report on competency-based education. And so I'm just going to sit here and let Shawlee take it from there.
Helpful. Good afternoon, Chair Cross,
Vice Chair Rowe, members of the commission, as Donna mentioned, for the record, my name is Shelley Hodson, and I am a policy advisor in the Office of Community Colleges and Workforce Development. And I'm thrilled to be at the HECC. I worked previously at Community Colleges and Workforce Development when it was a standalone agency, so excited to be back in role and with the agency. So today I'm going to give you some background on competency-based education, and I will not shorten it to CBE, but I will say those words a lot and really share some information about this report, trying to just hit the high points for you. You do have the draft report in your packet and to any questions and feedback. So the report is required by House Bill 2378, which was passed in 2021. This bill amended the existing statute and really did that to allocate some money to the Higher Education Coordinating Commission in $200,000 in general fund dollars to establish a competency-based pilot project or program, really to assist Oregon's higher education or post-secondary institutions with expanding competency-based education. It's currently competency-based education has a very small footprint in Oregon. Bill also retained the original reporting requirements, and really that's why we're here today, is really to give you that information related to progress made on implementing and expanding competency-based education. So competency-based education is a system or systems of instruction, assessment, grading, and academic reporting. Our success is defined based on students demonstrating progress towards competency in specific skills. So in a competency-based education model, students advance at the speed in which they demonstrate mastery of particular skills. So it's about how a student moves through a course versus specific seat time. The approach works really well for adult learners, specifically those who are already working because they have some work experience that they can apply. It's a little bit different than credit for prior learning, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. In a competency-based education model, faculty are really able to take existing courses and unpack those learning outcomes and rebuild the course with some more flexibility for the student, allowing them to show and demonstrate those competencies at their own pace. And it really supports or can support acceleration of progress toward credential and degree attainment. Nationally, there has been some progress in implementing competency-based education in post-secondary institutions. In 2020, there was a survey called the National Survey of Post-Secondary Competency-Based Education. And the results of that survey indicate that most responding institutions at that time were adding some form of competency-based education. There is some of that data is really interesting because the response rate was lower than it had been in previous years, and researchers believe that that was most likely due to the COVID-19. Doing other things. So in Oregon, adoption of competency-based education, as I said, continues to be really limited. There are a few examples in some of our public universities and community colleges. There are some private career schools that use this model, and also some registered apprenticeship programs that use at least some components of competency-based education. Most of the programs, again, use some components. There are very few programs that are purely competency-based education in Oregon, if there are any. Some programs combine competency-based education with traditional term-based or semester-based courses. They can also combine that with credit for prior learning and other acceleration strategies. And when done well, I think it really increases flexibility for students. But it can also be very confusing for students. I think there are several reasons for the slow expansion of competency-based education in higher ed, really including some specific barriers. Nationally, the barriers have been reported as the way institutional business systems and processes operate. They don't allow for that flexibility for people to accelerate their progress in a course. Other barriers are the startup costs for a competency-based education program. It takes some work to do that crosswalking that's required to make that happen. Information and education technology can be a barrier in some places. Limited on-campus expertise and faculty perceptions, and so people don't know about it, don't understand it, and struggle with how to implement. So those are some of the barriers nationally. In Oregon, and this was reported in the first report on this bill, the most significant barrier really appears to be the way state funding is determined or distributed to both universities and community colleges, which is really timely based on the last topic. The funding models are really, as you know, based on credit hours or student credit hours and don't account for students who could complete the course faster. And so I think that's a challenge for the way colleges and universities are funded, but it's also a challenge for the way that students pay for their education, because they may be able to complete a course in 6 weeks, but have paid for an 11-week course. Challenging. To address that, I think that could be a topic that might come up in work around formulas for the community colleges and universities at some point, if there was interest in possibly changing that. There's also work that would need to be done in the institution, again, to map those competencies to the additional credit hours and ensure that students were meeting the learning outcomes. With limited implementation, there's also really a limit on the data reflecting student outcomes in Oregon. Nationally, programs are serving students over the age of 25 and students that already have earned some college credits. Overall, the programs are nationally saving students money, and really that depends again on the pricing model and how quickly students are able to demonstrate competence. So given the context on implementing or expanding competency-based education, there are several funding and policy recommendations included in the report. Related to funding, as I noted earlier, the legislature has allocated $200,000 in the current biennium to support expansion. The agency has received 4 proposals for these funds, and we will be reviewing those in the coming weeks to make some funding decisions and where those projects are headed. Additionally, I mentioned this earlier, but as stakeholders are considering changes to funding formulas, it would be an opportune time to have a conversation about what a model might look like or incentives might look like to support the expansion of competency-based education. Some of the policy recommendations, so moving on to policy, have also been put forward by the legislature and the Oregon Workforce and Talent Development Board in their 2021 white paper, Equitable Prosperity for All. The grant program created by the legislature was recommended by the Workforce and Talent Development Board. So I think some really great synergy there between policy and that funding piece. The Workforce and Talent Development Board report also recommended that a shared language be created for competency, credentialing, and other hiring requirements. This really becomes essential when we start talking about how institutions may be combining different pieces, such as career and technical education, credit for higher learning, competency-based education. It becomes really confusing, not only for, I think, faculty and staff, but also definitely for students. So creating that language and clarity around those pieces, I think would be really helpful as we continue, hopefully, to expand these programs. Specifically on credit for prior learning, and you'll hear more about that from me, hopefully next month. That credit for prior learning, of course, is the opportunity for students to gain credit for what they already know. And I think as institutions think about aligning competency-based education and credit for prior learning in particular, it gets really confusing. And it's also really a great opportunity. So with some clarity around those terms and how they work, how students can access them, and I think the right combination of those things, it can really provide students with multiple options to accelerate their path to a certificate or a degree and move forward in really closing the achievement gap. There are some additional policy and practice recommendations included in the report. Many center around sharing information around competency-based education, what it is, how to implement it, what it looks like. Developing some policy and data tools as things expand, being able to capture student outcomes, and supporting as much as we can local champions that can bring forth this idea on their campuses and support sort of a culture shift or a system change in the way people think about this work. So in summary, there is some clear evidence nationwide that this is a strategy that works for specifically adult students. And going forward, we have a lot of work to do to clarify terms and to get people excited about it and provide some of that professional development. We also have some policy work to do to ensure that in place that support this work, that the agency is ready to support this kind of work and able to convene those conversations.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Commissioner Haynes.
Thank you, Chair Cross. I've just been too lazy to figure this out myself, so I was gonna ask. So the credits associated to both competency-based and credit for prior learning, are institutions reimbursed and FTE included in their funding calculation?
Great question.
Not on the community college side.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, for community colleges, it truly is the contact hours, which this type of a model would not have the full course contact hours, as Shali said, so it's excluded. I do believe the university funding formula does have a mechanism within it for credit for prior learning. And so there is some differences between the two.
I just recognize, I think there's an opportunity there to really up